The cold wind howled through the empty street as the night grew darker. A dim streetlight flickered, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the faint sound of wheels rolling against the ground. An elderly woman sat alone in a wheelchair, struggling to move forward against the chilling breeze. Her frail hands trembled as she gripped the wheels, her tired eyes scanning the desolate road ahead. She had been here before, this same lonely path, this same suffocating emptiness. But tonight felt different. Tonight something was watching her. A rustling sound came from the alley to her right. The woman's heart skipped a beat. She stopped, her breath hitching as she strained to listen. Was it the wind? A stray cat? Or something far more dangerous lurking in the shadows? Her fingers clutched the thin shawl draped over her shoulders as she tried to shake the fear creeping into her chest. Then she saw it. A lone dog emerged from the darkness. Its fur was matted and unkempt, its ribs faintly visible beneath its thin coat. The animal moved cautiously, its ears perked up, eyes locked onto hers. The woman stiffened, unsure whether to be afraid or relieved. Stray dogs could be unpredictable. Some were friendly while others were desperate and aggressive. But this one seemed different. The dog took a hesitant step forward, then another. Its tail hung low, not in aggression, but in uncertainty. It stopped just a few feet away, watching her with eyes that held an unmistakable sadness. The woman's throat tightened. There was something almost human in those eyes, a silent plea, a story untold. She had always believed in kindness, in helping those who had no one else. Gathering her courage, she slowly extended a trembling hand. "Hey there, boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Are you lost too?" For a moment, the dog didn't move. Then, as if understanding her words, it took another step closer. The woman felt her heart soften. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the remains of a bread roll she had saved from earlier. She broke off a small piece and held it out. The dog hesitated before inching forward, sniffing cautiously before gently taking the offering from her fingers. A gust of wind blew through the street and the woman shivered. The dog noticed, its ears twitching as it took a step closer as if sensing her vulnerability. Then, without warning, the dog's ears perked up sharply. It turned its head toward the darkness behind her, its body tense, muscles coiled. A low growl rumbled from its throat. The woman's breath caught. She turned her wheelchair slightly, her eyes widening as she saw movement in the shadows. Her heartbeat pounded in her chest. Someone, or something, was there. The dog took a defensive stance, placing itself between her and whatever lurked in the darkness. Its growl grew louder, more threatening. The woman's pulse raced as she clutched the arms of her wheelchair, fear creeping up her spine. Was this dog truly lost, or had it come to protect her from something she couldn't yet see? And then, in the silence of the night, a voice echoed from the darkness. "You shouldn't be out here alone." The woman's blood ran cold. Who was it? And why did they sound like they knew exactly who she was? The woman's fingers tightened around the arms of her wheelchair. The wind had picked up, whispering through the empty streets like a warning. The dog remained stiff, its body tense, tail low, eyes locked on the darkness beyond. "Who's there?" Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to sound strong. Silence. The shadows shifted. A figure stepped forward, just barely visible under the dim streetlight. A tall man, his features obscured by a hood, stood a few feet away. His hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he repeated, his voice calm but unsettling. The dog let out a deep, rumbling growl. It lowered its stance, muscles coiled as if ready to lunge. The woman swallowed hard. "I have company," she said, glancing down at the dog. "And he doesn't seem to like you very much." The man chuckled softly. "Smart dog," he muttered. Then with slow, deliberate steps, he moved backward, into the darkness, disappearing into the alley he had come from. The woman didn't dare breathe until the sound of his footsteps faded completely. Only then did she exhale, her body sagging with relief. She turned to the dog, her hand shaking as she reached out. "You just saved me, didn't you?" she whispered. The dog's tail gave the faintest wag. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to smile. The next morning, the woman sat by her window, sipping a cup of tea. The events of the previous night still haunted her. Who was that man? Why had he approached her? And why had he left so easily? A knock at the door made her jolt. Her heart pounded as she wheeled herself closer. Peeking through the curtain, she saw a young woman standing outside, looking hesitant. She had dark hair tied back into a loose ponytail and carried a small bag over her shoulder. With a deep breath, the elderly woman unlocked the door. "Yes?" she asked cautiously. "Hello, ma'am," the woman said. I think you might have found my dog." The old woman's heart skipped. She glanced behind her where the dog lay curled up near the couch. At the sound of the stranger's voice, its head lifted, ears twitching, the young woman stepped forward. "His name is Rusty. He went missing 2 weeks ago." Her voice softened. "He's my best friend." "Rusty." The old woman looked at the dog again. He hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. He had a past, a family. But why had he stayed with her? She hesitated. He saved my life last night." The young woman frowned. "What do you mean?" Taking a deep breath, the woman recounted everything. The eerie feeling, the man in the alley, how Rusty had protected her. The young woman's expression darkened. "That sounds like him," she murmured. "Rusty has always had a good sense for danger." The elderly woman glanced at the dog again. Rusty was watching her, his eyes soft but filled with an unspoken question. She sighed. "I suppose he belongs with you?" The young woman smiled, kneeling beside Rusty and scratching behind his ears. "I'd love to take him home, but if he wants to stay with you, I won't force him." The old woman's heart swelled. She had spent so many years alone. For the first time in a long time, she had felt truly safe. She looked into Rusty's eyes. "What do you say, boy?" The dog let out a soft whine, then nudged her hand with his nose. The answer was clear. Rusty had chosen her. That night, the elderly woman couldn't shake the unease in her chest. Rusty lay beside her, his ears twitching at every sound outside. The memory of the hooded man still haunted her. His voice, the way he had stepped forward and then disappeared like a shadow melting into the darkness. She turned off the lamp and tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Then, a sound. A faint, scraping noise, almost like nails dragging across wood. Her breath hitched. She turned her head toward the window, her heart hammering. Rusty was already up, ears perked, body stiff. His growl was low, quiet, but filled with warning. The sound came again. Someone was outside. The woman's fingers tightened on the arms of her wheelchair. The streetlights cast long shadows against her curtains, but she couldn't see anyone. The old fear returned, coiling inside her chest. Then Rusty did something that made her blood run cold. Instead of barking, instead of lunging toward the door, he stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, like a hunter stalking prey. His growl deepened, lips curling just slightly to reveal his teeth. Whoever was out there, Rusty knew them. The woman barely had time to process this before the lock on her front door clicked. A key. Her mind reeled. A stranger wouldn't have a key. No one else should have access to her home. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and quickly dialed 911. Her voice was barely a whisper as she gave her address. Then the door creaked open. Rusty let out a fierce snarl and launched forward, but a harsh voice cut through the air. "Back, now." The hooded man. This time she could see him clearly. He wasn't just some drifter lurking in the dark. His face was familiar, too familiar. Her breath caught in her throat. Kevin? The name felt foreign on her tongue, a name she hadn't spoken in years. The man pushed back his hood, revealing a sharp, gaunt face, dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite understand. "I told you," he murmured, stepping inside. "You shouldn't be alone." Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just a random stranger, this was her nephew. The boy she had raised after his parents, her younger brother and his wife, had died in an accident. The boy she had tried to love, but who had vanished from her life a decade ago without a word. And now, here he was, breaking into her home. Rusty didn't back down. He positioned himself between them, his stance protective. The woman's voice shook. What are you doing here? Kevin's expression flickered. I came back to check on you, to make sure you were safe. Her eyes darted to the lock. With a key, a slow smirk tugged at his lips. I never gave mine back. She felt sick. Rusty barked, snapping at the air between them. Kevin's gaze flicked to the dog, and for the first time, he looked uneasy. That mutt wasn't here last time. The woman swallowed hard. No, he wasn't. Kevin's fingers twitched. You don't understand. I came to... A sharp knock at the door. Kevin froze. The woman's heart leapt with relief. The police, Rusty barked again, this time louder, more urgent. The knocking grew more forceful. Ma'am, this is the police. Is everything okay? Kevin's jaw tightened. You called them? The woman met his eyes. You let yourself into my house in the middle of the night. What did you expect me to do? A tense silence filled the air. Then Kevin took a slow step back, raising his hand slightly. This isn't over, he murmured. But Rusty wasn't waiting for him to make a move. With a sudden burst of speed, the dog lunged, grabbing the sleeve of Kevin's jacket and yanking him back just as the front door burst open. The officers rushed in, get on the ground. Kevin barely had time to react before he was forced down, hands restrained behind his back. The woman could only watch, her breath shuddering in and out. It was over. Rusty trotted back to her side, his tail still stiff, but his eyes soft when he looked up at her. She reached down, running her fingers through his fur. You saved me, she whispered. The officer turned to her. Ma'am, do you know this man? She let out a heavy sigh. Yes. He's my nephew. The officers exchanged glances before one of them helped her move away from the door. Kevin didn't speak as they escorted him out. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hear what he had to say. But one thing was certain. If Rusty hadn't been there, the night might have ended very differently. The night's events left the elderly woman shaken. Even after the police left, even after Kevin was taken away in handcuffs, the weight of what had happened pressed against her chest like an iron burden. She sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the old family photo on the mantelpiece. It was from decades ago, a younger version of herself standing beside her brother, and between them a small boy with bright eyes and a mischievous grin. Kevin, her nephew. The same boy who had once clung to her hand when he was afraid of thunderstorms. The same boy who used to laugh at her bedtime stories. Where had it all gone wrong? A heavy sigh escaped her lips as she leaned back in her wheelchair. Rusty, ever faithful, sat by her feet, his head resting against her leg. She ran a trembling hand through his fur. What am I supposed to do now, boy? Now? Rusty let out a low whine, as if he understood the turmoil inside her. A part of her wanted to shut out everything, to lock her doors and pretend none of this had happened. But another part, an older, wiser part, knew that she couldn't run from the past forever. The next day. The morning arrived with soft golden light spilling through the curtains, but the weight in her heart remained. She spent most of the morning on the phone, first with the police, then with a lawyer, and finally with the detective handling Kevin's case. The details were grim. Kevin had been in trouble for years. Petty theft, fraud, and now, attempted burglary. But there was something else. He wasn't trying to steal from her. The officers found no tools, no weapons, only an old key that he had kept all these years. The lawyer's voice was calm, but firm. It's clear he wasn't there to rob you, he was watching over you. She frowned. Watching over me? There are security camera records. He's been around your neighborhood for weeks, keeping an eye on your home. The woman's fingers tightened on the phone. That explained the strange feeling she'd had, the sensation of being watched, but why? She needed answers. Visiting Kevin 2 days later, she found herself in a cold, gray room inside the county jail. The air smelled of disinfectant and steel. The officer led her inside, where Kevin sat behind a glass partition, his wrists cuffed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kevin exhaled and gave her a lopsided smile. "Didn't think you'd come." She studied his face, older, sharper, but still the boy she once knew. "I need to understand," she said softly. "Why? Were you there that night?" Kevin leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "I wasn't going to hurt you," she nodded. "I believe that. But that doesn't answer my question." A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Regret? Shame? Finally, he sighed. "I was making sure you were safe." Her breath hitched. "From what?" Kevin hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "From the people I owe money to." Her stomach twisted. "You're in trouble." He let out a dry chuckle. "That's an understatement." The weight of realization settled over her. He wasn't just lurking in the shadows. He had been protecting her. Tears burned her eyes. "Why didn't you just come to me?" Kevin's jaw clenched. "After everything I did? After running away? After wasting my life? I didn't deserve your help." She shook her head. "You're still my family." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Kevin cleared his throat. "That dog of yours, Rusty, he's a good one." A small smile tugged at her lips. "He saved me that night." Kevin chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, he saved me too, in a way." She tilted her head. "How?" "For years, I convinced myself that I didn't belong anywhere, that I was nothing but a lost cause. But that night, when Rusty stood in front of you, protecting you, I realized something." He met her eyes. "I still had someone who cared." Her heart ached at his words, and in that moment, she made a decision. A second chance. The weeks that followed were filled with legal battles and difficult conversations. The court considered Kevin's history, but also the fact that he hadn't intended to harm her. She spoke in his defense, not to excuse his actions, but to give him a chance at redemption. Kevin was sentenced to probation and mandatory rehabilitation instead of prison time. It wasn't an easy road, but it was better than the alternative, and slowly, over time, he began to rebuild his life. At first, their conversations were awkward, but little by little, trust returned. He visited her often, sitting on her porch while Rusty lay at their feet. One evening, as they watched the sunset, Kevin turned to her. "You know, if you'll have me, I'd like to stick around, help out, maybe even get my life together for real this time." She smiled, placing a gentle hand over his. "You always had a home here, Kevin." Rusty gave a happy bark, as if in agreement. And, for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope.